He was 23, and they told him to go home. No father to speak for him, no bank behind him, no ranch brand in his name. Just a folded map, a bone-handled knife his grandfather had left him, and $42 in a leather pouch. And with that $42, he meant to file on a stretch of neglected mountain grass above Pine Creek that every older man in the county had already dismissed as worthless. But what none of those men had bothered to walk was a shadowed draw beyond a caved-in root cellar, and what waited there would change his life. Settle in with us. Subscribe if you haven't yet, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. James Marsh had been born in a low-frame house on the Eastern Flats, the second son of a wheat man who broke his back on rented ground, and a mother who taught school until the winter she caught fever and did not rise from it. He was 9 when she died, and 11 when his father remarried a widow from 2 counties over. A decent enough woman with 2 boys of her own who wanted the small parlor for their beds and the small allowance for their pockets. And James understood, in the way a quiet child understands these things, that he had become a guest in the house where he had been born. He did not resent it. He simply began, from that year on, to look elsewhere for the shape of his life. That looking led him, at 12, up the wagon road to his mother's uncle, a man named Harlan Beek, who ran a stringy little cattle outfit at the edge of the foothills and had never married and never seemed to want to. Harlan was 61 when James first walked up his lane carrying a bundle of clothes and a tin cup, and he took one long look at the boy, spat into the yard, and told him where the woodpile was. That was the beginning of James's real education. Harlan taught him how to shoe a horse without quarrel, and how to read the age of a fence by the way the wire had settled, and how to find a spring in dry country by watching where the deer bedded at first light, and where the swallows cut low in the evening. Harlan taught him how to measure a section without a chain, using a horse's stride and a pocket watch, and how to sit still long enough for a piece of country to tell you what it was. He was not a warm man in the way a mother is warm, but he was steady, and he never once looked at James as if the boy were in the way. In 11 years under that roof, James never heard him raise his voice, and he never heard him lie. Harlan died on a Tuesday in March, of nothing more dramatic than his heart giving out over a cup of coffee, and the small ranch went to a nephew on the paying side of the family, who had not visited in 15 years, but who had the papers to prove his claim. James was told he could stay through the branding if he wanted the wages, and after that, he should look to himself. He did not argue. He rolled his blankets, saddled the bay gelding Harlan had given him on his 18th birthday, and took with him 3 things: a canvas coat, a battered surveyor's compass Harlan had used since before James was born, and the bone-handled knife his grandfather had pressed into his hand on his mother's funeral day. A knife whose handle had darkened with 60 years of use and whose blade had been sharpened so many times, the edge curved inward like a slow smile. That knife rode in a sheath at his hip and had never been out of his reach for 14 years, and when he touched the handle in the dark of a strange camp, he could still, sometimes, hear his grandfather's voice explaining how a man's tools were the only inheritance that mattered. He drifted north through the summer, hiring on for hay and fence work where he could, sleeping in barns and under wagons, and it was in a bunkhouse near the Bitter Fork that he first heard talk of the unclaimed strip above Pine Creek. The older hands laughed about it around the stove. 600 acres, they said, of nothing but rock and thin grass, and a couple of falling-down line shacks left over from a stage road that had been rerouted 20 years back. A man had tried to prove it in '79 and given up. Another had walked the boundary once and never come back to file. It was too high for winter cattle and too dry for a plow and too far from the rail to bother about, and the land office in the county seat kept the papers on it. In a drawer nobody opened. James listened without speaking, the way Harlan had taught him to listen. And that night he lay awake in the hayloft and turned the compass over in his hands and thought about what 600 acres might look like to a man who had learned to read country instead of curse it. In the morning he drew his last pay from the hay crew, folded the bills into the leather pouch with the coins he had been keeping since spring, and counted $42 laid flat on the boards of an empty stall. He saddled the bay, tied his roll behind the cantle, slid the surveyor's compass into the inside pocket of the canvas coat, and rode down out of the Bitter Fork country toward the county seat at Ashler Bend. It took him 2.5 days at an easy pace, and he came into town on a Thursday morning with dust on his hat and the smell of horse on his shirt, and the map folded twice inside his coat against his ribs. The land office sat on the shaded side of the square between a feed store and a lawyer's shingle, a low building with a warped porch and a bell over the door that rang once when he stepped inside. There were 3 men in the room. 2 of them leaned on the counter drinking coffee out of tin cups, and the third sat behind the counter in a wooden chair with the ledger open in front of him and a pair of reading glasses low on his nose. His name, painted on the glass, was Ernest Prewitt, and he had been the register in that office for 19 years. James took off his hat and said good morning, and laid the folded map on the counter, and told them, in the flat, plain way Harlan had taught him to speak in rooms where he was not known, that he had come to file on the 600 acres above Pine Creek that were sitting unclaimed in the drawer. The 2 men at the counter looked at him and then looked at each other. And one of them, a thick-shouldered rancher with a gray mustache who ran cattle on the flats east of town, laughed once through his nose. Ernest Prewitt did not laugh. He looked at James over the reading glasses and asked him how old he was, and James said 23, and Ernest Prewitt asked him whether he had a witness or a surety or any letter from any man in the county, and James said he did not. He said he had ridden for Harlan Beek for 11 years and could give the name of any brand inspector between the Bitter Fork and the Eastern Flats. But Ernest Prewitt only tapped the end of his pencil against the ledger and shook his head slowly. That land, he said, was a fool's errand. Better men than James had walked it and left it. It would not carry cattle through a winter, and it would not raise a crop, and it sat too high and too far. And a boy of 23 with $42 in his pocket and no outfit behind him had no business tying himself to a claim he could not prove up. The rancher at the counter said, not unkindly, that the boy ought to go hire on somewhere south for the fall and think about it again in 5 years, when he had put 100 head together and a wife to keep the fire. James did not answer. He folded the map back into its 2 creases and put it inside his coat and set his hat on his head and thanked Ernest Prewitt for his time. At the door he turned and asked quietly whether the drawer was locked or whether a man might still walk the ground and mark the boundaries himself before filing, and Ernest Prewitt said the ground was open country and any man could walk it who was fool enough to try. James nodded once and stepped out into the square. He rode east that afternoon, past 3 ranch houses whose owners the older hands in the bunkhouse had named, and at each gate he asked the same question in the same flat voice, and at each gate a man came out to the porch and looked him over and said some version of what Ernest Prewitt had said. One of them, an older widower named Boyd Askin, who ran a good outfit on the low benches and had known Harlan a long time ago, softened enough to give him a cup of coffee and a slab of bread on the porch. But even Boyd Askin shook his head at the end of it and said the land above Pine Creek had beaten better men, and James should not lay his youth against it. James thanked him for the coffee and rode on. He camped that night in a fold of ground below a broken cottonwood and did not build a fire. He sat with his back to the saddle and the compass in his lap and the knife across his knee. And he thought about the two men at the counter laughing and about Boyd Askin's kind refusal. And he understood that no man in the county was going to lend him a name or a wagon or an hour of work, and that the claim, if it was going to be his, would have to be walked and marked and understood by him alone before he set foot back in Ernest Prewitt's office. He slept 4 hours and rose before the light and saddled the bay in the cold and rode north. The country climbed slowly for the first day and then more sharply on the second. He left the wagon roads at a shallow ford and took a game trail that bent up through juniper and sage, and by noon the sage had thinned to bunch grass, and the junipers had given way to scattered ponderosa. The bay walked steady under him with his ears forward, the way Harlan's horses always walked in new country, and James let the reins hang loose and read the ground as it opened. He saw where an old freight track had been cut into a side hill and then left to fill with pine needles. And he saw the wire of a fence that had gone down 20 years ago, strung along the ground in loose gray coils. And he saw a broken stovepipe rusting in the grass beside a square of blackened stones where a stage cook had once boiled coffee for men who no longer passed that way. The wind came down through the pines in long, steady breaths that smelled of resin and dry stone, and once, near the top of a saddle, he heard the small, dry rattle of an aspen grove trembling in air that had not yet reached him. He camped that night above a thin creek where the water ran clear over pale gravel, and he watched swallows cut low across the pool in the failing light, and marked in his mind the place they were feeding. On the third morning, he came out of a stand of lodgepole onto a long shelf of open ground, and he pulled the bay up and sat looking at what he had come for. 600 acres, more or less, of thin mountain grass laid across the shoulder of a ridge, with pines standing thick on the north edge and the ground falling away to the south into a shadowed draw. 2 line shacks slumped at either end of the shelf. A stovepipe leaned on one of them. The wind moved through the grass in long, slow rolls, and the grass, though thin, was longer than any of the men in Ashler Bend had allowed it to be in their talk. James sat a long time without moving. Then he swung down, loosened the cinch, and began to walk. He walked the shelf first without hurry, because Harlan had taught him that a man who runs at new ground learns nothing from it. The near-line shack stood at the east end, where the ridge began to drop, and it was built of squared lodgepole notched at the corners in the plain way of stage road work, 12 feet by 14 by his stride, with a shake roof gone soft along the north pitch, and a door hung on leather hinges, cracked to the width of a knife. The stovepipe leaned out through the roof at an angle a wind had put on it, and the flashing tin was rust brown down to lace. Inside, the floor was of split puncheon laid on sleepers set in the dirt, and 3 of the puncheons had rotted at their ends and gone spongy where snow had blown in under the door for 20 winters. A bunk frame was pegged to the north wall, empty. A shelf ran above it with a tin plate on it, blackened, and a horseshoe nail bent to a hook. A sheet iron stove stood in the middle of the room on 4 flat stones, its door hanging open on one hinge, and inside the firebox, the ash of the last fire that had ever been made in it lay untouched. The chinking between the logs had fallen out in long stretches, and the daylight came through in bright, thin lines that showed the dust in the air. He walked from the near shack west along the shelf, counting his strides in 50s as Harlan had counted them. And where the ground dipped, he found the second shack in worse condition, its south wall bowed and one corner settled a foot below the other, so that the door frame leaned like a man tired of standing. Beyond it the pines began, and past the first line of pines he came on the caved-in root cellar the older hands had mentioned in the bunkhouse. A rectangle set into the slope with a log crib for its walls, and a roof of poles that had failed inward under the weight of 40 snowfalls, leaving a shallow pit floored with rotten wood and last year's leaves. The door lay flat on the ground, half buried, its iron hasp still bolted through the plank, and above the pit a stovepipe of thicker gauge than the one in the shack lay in the grass, cut and capped, as if someone had once meant to run a fire down there against the winter and had never done it. South of the cellar, the ground fell into the shadowed draw. He walked to the lip and looked down and saw what the men in Ashlar Bend had not bothered to see, which was that the draw did not fall dry, but held a dark line of willow along its bottom. And where there is willow, there is water. The wind came up the draw carrying the smell of wet ground even in the late summer dryness of the shelf above. James went down the slope carefully with the bay tied above him, and at the foot of the willows he found a soft place in the earth, and 10 steps beyond that, a shallow pool no larger than a wash basin where a spring rose slow and steady out of gravel and ran off into the grass and disappeared underground again within 100 feet. He knelt and put his hand to the water. It was cold as snowmelt, and it did not slow. He sat on his heels a long time and watched swallows come down over the willows in the last of the light. And he understood then, without saying it aloud, that the men in Ashlar Bend had walked the shelf and turned around at the caved-in cellar and never come this far. He camped that night on the shelf beside the near shack with a small fire built of down pine, and in the morning he began to walk the boundaries in earnest, with the compass in his hand, and the map spread on a flat stone weighted with pebbles at its corners. He paced the north line first along the edge of the pines, and then the east line down along the fall of the ridge, and by the 3rd day of walking he had put a cairn of 3 stones at every quarter mile, and he had a fair notion of what the 600 acres actually held and what they did not. The grass was thin, but it was fescue and blue bunch, not cheatgrass, and it ran back into shade under the north pines where it would hold through a dry August. The spring in the draw ran a steady quart a minute by his hat brim and his pocket watch. There was down timber enough to rebuild a roof 3 times over. What the older men had called a fool's errand was a place with water, wood, grass, and shelter. And the only thing wrong with it was that no one had walked past the root cellar in 20 years. On the 4th morning, he went back to the cellar with a shovel he had cut from a split pine and a length of the fallen fence wire twisted into a probe, and he began not to dig it out, but to work around it. Because Harlan had taught him that a man who wants to know a place looks first at its edges. He cleared the leaves from the fallen door and lifted it aside, and he saw that the log crib of the cellar did not sit square with the slope, but was set at a small angle, as if it had been built against something older that was already there. He walked around the back of the pit into the pines and put his boot into the duff and felt it give under his weight in a shape that was not a natural hollow. He knelt and brushed the pine needles aside with the flat of his hand, and he found beneath them the top course of a wall of river stones set in lime mortar, 4 stones long and 2 stones deep before the moss began. He worked outward from that corner slowly, a foot at a time, and by noon he had laid bare the footprint of a cabin 16 feet by 20, its sill logs long since rotted to black lines in the earth, its stone hearth still standing at the north end, with the chimney fallen in a heap of stones around it, and its threshold marked by 2 flat slabs worn smooth in their centers, where a door had once opened and closed on the same track for a long time. He stood a while looking at it. Whoever had built the root cellar had built it after this cabin, and had built it with the cabin already gone or going. The cellar had been the second thing on the ground. The first thing had been a house, and the house had been here long enough to wear the stone of its threshold. He cleared the hearth last. He lifted the fallen chimney stones one by one and set them aside in a low wall to the north, and he swept the ash and the pine duff off the flagstones of the hearth itself with a bundle of grass tied in a knot. The hearth was made of 5 flags of dressed sandstone laid on a bed of smaller stones, and 4 of them sat true. And the 5th, the one nearest the room and farthest from the fire, sat proud of the others by the thickness of a finger. He looked at it a long time. Then he took the bone-handled knife from his hip, and he worked its point into the seam around the raised flag, and he pried. The stone came up easier than he expected, as if it had been meant to come up, and beneath it lay a small hollow lined with the same lime mortar as the walls, and in the hollow sat a tin biscuit box with a lithograph of a pheasant on its lid, and a folded oilcloth beside it, and a smaller thing wrapped in a piece of blue calico that had faded almost to white. He sat back on his heels. He did not open anything for a long minute. The wind moved through the pines above him in the same long, steady breaths it had made when he first came onto the shelf, and somewhere down in the draw a jay called twice, and then went quiet. He lifted the tin box first and set it on the flagstone beside him, and he pried the lid up with his thumbnail. Inside, laid in a neat course on a folded square of muslin, were gold coins, 8 double eagles and 4 half-eagles, and a small stack of silver dollars beside them, and beneath the muslin, when he lifted it, a folded paper sealed at its edge with a bead of candle wax gone brown with age. He counted the coins on the flagstone. $190 in gold, and 11 silver dollars beside it. $201 in all, laid away in a hearth on a shelf of ground that no man in Ashler Bend had thought worth the walk. He unwrapped the blue calico next. Inside was a child's tin whistle, dented on one side, and a lock of pale hair tied with a thread. He held them in his palm a while, and then set them gently on the muslin beside the coins. He broke the wax on the folded paper last. The paper was thick and had yellowed at its folds, but the ink was still black, written in a careful schoolteacher's hand that sloped a little to the right, and he read it slowly, sitting on his heels on the hearthstone in the pine shade, with the bay grazing above him on the shelf. "My name is Ada Renfrew," the letter began, "and I lived on this ground 14 years. My husband Thomas built this cabin the summer of '61 before he went east to the war, and he came back to it in '65, and we kept it together 9 years more. He died of pneumonia in the winter of '74 and is buried under the largest pine at the north edge of the meadow, and our boy Samuel, who was 4, is buried beside him. I taught the station children reading and figures for the last 6 years the coaches ran, and when the road was moved south, I stayed on because I did not know where else to be. I am writing this in the fall of '80, and I am going down to my sister in Missouri because I am 61 years old, and my hands will not split wood any longer. I am leaving the coins because I cannot spend them where I am going, and because I would rather they went to whoever comes here next than to a bank that does not know my name. The spring is in the draw south of the cellar, and it does not fail. The grass in the north shade will carry a small herd through a dry year. The pine at the north corner is the marker for Thomas and Samuel, and I would ask that whoever reads this leave it standing. I hope you are a young person, and I hope you have come to stay. I was happy on this ground, and I want you to be. Ada Renfrew, October the 9th, 1880. James read the letter through twice, and then he folded it back along its creases and set it on the flagstone beside the coins and the whistle and the lock of pale hair. He sat a long time on the hearth of a house that had not stood for 30 years, and he did not weep, because he had not wept in public since his mother's burial, and he did not weep in private now. But he took the bone-handled knife from where he had laid it beside him, and he set it on the muslin next to the tin whistle, and for a while the two things sat together in the pine light. A knife his grandfather had given him on the day his mother went into the ground, and a whistle a woman named Ada Renfrew had wrapped in blue calico for a boy of 4 who had gone into the ground before her, and the two objects were of a kind, and he knew it. And he sat with them until the shadow of the north pines came across the hearth and covered them both. When he finally stood up from the hearth, the light on the shelf had gone amber and the wind had dropped, and James did the practical thing, which was to gather Ada Renfrew's coins back into the tin biscuit box beneath the lithograph of the pheasant, wrap the whistle and the lock of pale hair back into the blue calico, and fold the letter into a square small enough to ride in the inside pocket of his coat, beside his own folded map. He set the flagstone back in its place over the empty hollow, laid the fallen chimney stones over the flagstone in the shape they had lain for 30 years, and returned to the near-line shack to sleep. He had come up the shelf with $42 in a leather pouch, and he was going down with $201 more, and a claim he now understood better than any man in the county, and a letter in a schoolteacher's hand telling him where the water was and where the graves were, and asking him to stay. He rode back to Ashler Bend in 2 days at a working pace, and on the Monday morning after he had first walked into the land office, he walked into it a second time and laid on Ernest Prewitt's counter the folded map with his cairns marked in pencil, a page from a pocketbook on which he had written the boundaries in strides and compass bearings, and, without saying what it was, the filing fee counted out in the same gold coins Ada Renfrew had left under her hearth. Ernest Prewitt looked at the coins over the top of his reading glasses, looked at James, and looked at the map, and did not laugh this time. He asked James one question, which was whether he had walked the whole ground, and James said he had walked it and marked it. And Ernest Prewitt took up his pen and opened the ledger and wrote the claim in for James Marsh. Age 23, 640 acres more or less, on the north shelf above Pine Creek, with a spring and a hearth as improvements noted in the register's own hand. He stamped the paper and dated it and slid it across the counter, and he said, quietly, that a man who had walked the ground was owed his say, and that he wished James luck. The rancher with the gray mustache was not in the office that morning. James used 40 of Ada Renfrew's dollars in Ashler Bend before he left. He bought a felling axe with an ash handle from Doss Merritt's Hardware, a 2-man crosscut with the teeth still true, a keg of 10-penny nails, a bundle of shakes tied with sisal, a sack of dry oats for the bay, and 8 pounds of coffee, 6 pounds of beans, and a side of bacon from Renshaw's Dry Goods, and the rest he kept in the tin beneath the muslin, because a man does not spend what he does not yet need. On the road back up to the shelf, he stopped at Boyd Askin's low bench and told the widower, plainly and without triumph, that he had filed and that he meant to work the ground. And Boyd Askin looked at him a long moment, and then went into his barn and came out leading a red mule named Pete, and said the mule was old but sound, and would pull a stone boat all day, and James could have the loan of him through the fall for the price of feed. That was the first hand laid on the work. The second was Willem Otway, 68 years old, a retired stage carpenter who had helped build the very line shacks James now meant to unbuild, and who came up the wagon track with his own froe and mallet on a Saturday, because Boyd had told him where James was. Willem Otway showed James how to split fresh shakes from a length of straight-grained pine with the froe held vertical and the mallet swung short, and he stayed 3 days on the shelf and taught James to re-notch a corner where a sill had rotted, using the same plain saddle notch the stage road men had used 40 years back. He would not take coin. He took a jar of the spring water, which he said he remembered, and a supper of beans and bacon at the fire. The third was a woman, Miss Adele Hobart, 44, who kept the school at the Pine Creek settlement 8 miles below, and who rode up on a gray mare one afternoon with a covered basket because word had traveled that a young man was working alone on the shelf where Ada Renfrew had once taught. She had been one of Ada Renfrew's students in the last year the coaches ran, and she sat on the hearth with James and drank coffee from a tin cup and told him what she remembered of Ada, which was a tall woman with ink on her fingers and a low voice, and a boy who had been buried under the pine before Miss Hobart was old enough to remember him well. She asked if she could see the letter, and James let her read it, and she gave it back with both hands. She left the basket and rode down. Others came in the weeks that followed as the work made itself known. Tobias Larkin, 31, a brand inspector out of the Bitter Fork who had known Harlan Beek, brought up a wagon of milled boards James had paid for at the sawmill and would not charge cartage. Elmer Pace, 52, ran a small band of sheep on the benches to the west and traded James 2 ewes and a ram for a week of James's labor at Elmer's shearing. A boy of 14 named Whit Danvers, who wanted to learn to shoe, rode up on Saturdays for a month and held horses for James at the forge. Willem Otway had helped him rig behind the near shack. James rebuilt the near line shack first because it was the sounder of the two, and because Ada Renfrew's cabin footprint he meant to leave untouched under its pines. He tore off the soft north pitch of the shake roof and redecked it with the boards Tobias had hauled, laid new shakes over them course by course from the eave up, and set the ridge shakes double against the wind. He pulled the rotten puncheons from the floor and replaced them with green pine planks that would season in place. He re-chinked the walls with a mud of clay from the draw and dry grass and horsehair from the bay's mane, worked into the gaps with the flat of his hand. He straightened the stovepipe and reflashed it with new tin. He hung a plank door on strap hinges Willem Otway forged in an afternoon at the little forge behind the shack. He cleaned the sheet iron stove, replaced its broken hinge with a leather one until iron could be had, and made a first fire in it on an evening in late September, and the smoke drew clean. By the first hard frost of October, the near shack was a house, and the second shack, dismantled for its logs, had become a lean-to shed for the mule Pete and the bay, and James had a corral of peeled poles set against the north pines, and he had cut and stacked 4 cords of down lodgepole for the winter, and he had walked to the great pine at the north corner and cleared the brush around it and left it standing as Ada Renfrew had asked. Word of the work went down the wagon roads the way word does in that country, quietly and accurately. By November, James Marsh's name was known in 3 settlements. When he rode into Pine Creek for salt and lamp oil, the storekeeper, a heavy man named Alvin Pettibone, who had never in his life given credit to a stranger, wrote James's account into the ledger without asking for a name against it, because Willem Otway had said Willem's name was enough, and Boyd Askin had said the same. When James rode into Ashler Bend on the first Saturday in December to pay the balance of his filing costs, Ernest Prewitt met him at the counter and asked after the spring by name, and James said the spring was running a steady quart to a quart and a half by his hat brim and pocket watch through the freeze, and Ernest Prewitt wrote that into the improvement column of the ledger in a small, careful hand. Small rituals began without anyone naming them rituals. On Sundays, Miss Adele Hobart rode up the wagon track with 2 of the older school children behind her, and they sat on the hearth of Ada Renfrew's cabin among the pines, while Miss Hobart read aloud from a battered copy of a reader Ada herself had used, and James listened from his own doorway with his coffee in his hand. On the last Saturday of every month, Willem Otway came up to check the notches he had cut, and to eat a supper of beans and bacon, and would not go home before he had walked once around the near shack with his hand on the logs. When Whit Danvers had learned enough to shoe a horse alone, his father, a quiet homesteader named Reuben Danvers who ran a hay meadow on Pine Creek, sent up a wagon load of loose hay for the bay and the mule, and would not take payment beyond a cup of coffee at the door. Boyd Askin rode up once in the early snow to see the corral, and to bring back the price he thought fair for the 2 ewes and the ram Elmer Pace had traded, because Boyd said a man ought to know what his sheep were worth in his own country. James kept Ada Renfrew's letter in a tin box on the shelf above his bunk, where the blackened tin plate and the bent horseshoe nail had been, and he kept the whistle and the lock of pale hair in the blue calico beside it, and he kept the bone-handled knife on his hip, as he had kept it for 14 years. When men in Ashler Bend spoke of the North Shelf now, they did not call it the Fool's Ground. They called it the Marsh Place. Ernest Pruitt, in his register, wrote it the same way. On a still evening in the middle of January, when the shelf lay under a foot of dry snow and the pines at the north edge held their weight without dropping it, James sat on a stool inside the near shack with the stove ticking behind him and the lamp turned low on the plank table Willem Otway had helped him nail together. The Bay and Pete stood side by side in the lean-to shed with their breath rising white through the chinks. The corral poles were black against the snow. The great pine at the north corner, where Thomas and Samuel were buried, stood taller than the rest by a full length, and threw its long shadow east across the shelf as the moon came up. The spring in the draw ran under a lip of ice at a steady quart a minute, as it had run through every freeze since 1861 and, James guessed, for a good many years before that. James took down the tin box from the shelf above his bunk, where the blackened tin plate and the bent horseshoe nail had been, and he set it on the plank table under the lamp. He laid out its contents the way a man lays out tools before a piece of work. He set Ada Renfrew's folded letter on the boards, and beside it the muslin, and on the muslin the 8 double eagles and the 4 half-eagles and the 11 silver dollars less what he had spent on the axe and the crosscut and the nails and the shakes and the oats and the coffee and the beans and the bacon. He unwrapped the blue calico and laid the child's tin whistle beside the coins and the lock of pale hair beside the whistle. Then he drew the bone-handled knife from the sheath at his hip and laid it across the muslin next to the whistle, so that the 2 objects touched. The handle of the knife had been darkened by 60 years of use in his grandfather's hand, and now in his. The whistle had been dented on one side by a boy who was buried under the great pine at the north corner in the winter of '74. 2 objects from 2 people he had never met, given by 2 strangers who had each loved a child they never got to see grow, and both of them come at last into the same lamplight on the same plank table in a house he had built with borrowed tools and his own hands. He thought of Harlan Beek, who had taught him to shoe a horse and read the age of a fence by the wire and find a spring by watching deer at first light and swallows in the evening, and who had died on a Tuesday in March of his heart giving out over a cup of coffee, and whose small ranch had gone to a nephew James had never seen. He thought of his mother, dead of fever when he was 9, and of his father, who had married a widow and let her sons keep the front room. He thought of Ernest Pruitt behind his ledger with his glasses low on his nose, telling him that the ground was a fool's errand and that better men than he had walked it and left it, and of the rancher with the gray mustache who had laughed once through his nose and said James should come back in 5 years with 100 head and a wife. He thought of Boyd Askin's slab of bread on the porch and the kindness in it, which had also been a dismissal. Each of them had been right about what they could see. None of them had walked past the caved-in root cellar into the pines to feel the give of duff over a wall of river stones set in lime mortar. None of them had gone down into the draw to find the pool no larger than a wash basin where the water rose cold and steady out of the gravel. None of them had known Ada Renfrew's name. He folded the letter along its worn creases and put it back in the tin. He wrapped the whistle and the lock of pale hair back into the blue calico. He put the coins back under the muslin and closed the pheasant lithograph over them. He returned the knife to the sheath at his hip. He set the tin box back on the shelf above his bunk, beside the blackened plate and the bent horseshoe nail. And he stood a moment in the doorway with his coffee and looked out across the shelf under the moon, at the corral and the lean-to and the great pine and the stovepipe rising straight from his own roof with a thin line of smoke going up into the still cold. James Marsh was 23 and had been told he was too young to file a claim. He had $42 in a leather pouch and a folded map and a bone-handled knife and no man in the county to speak his name. And he spent that $42 on 600 acres of neglected mountain grass above Pine Creek that older men had walked away from. It was the best $42 he ever spent. If this story stayed with you, take a moment now to subscribe and to share it with someone who has been told they were too young, too poor, too alone, or too far outside the room to be taken seriously. And before you go on with your evening, sit with this question a while. What piece of ground in your own life have the people around you already walked past and given up on? And what might you find there if you were willing to go a few steps farther than the last man who tried?